Hello and welcome to the Boot Room. Andy, Warren and Stuart Watson here to look ahead to Ipswich Town's home clash with Barnsley in League One. And Stu, this is all rolling along rather nicely at the moment. Top of the table going into the final league game of August. It's going all right, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a strange feeling, isn't it? There's been a couple of pretty routine, comfortable wins in there as well. 3-0 against both MK Dons and Shrewsbury. A fair bit of grit shown at Burton, bit of character to come back against Bolton and get that draw on the opening day. So Ipswich have answered a few of those questions that we maybe had lingering towards the back end of last season. But I think we're all just trying to just temper that excitement, because Ipswich have obviously had a couple of good starts to the season since dropping down into League One, and we know the slog that is still ahead, still a long way to go. But yeah, as starts go, it's been decent.
It certainly has. You look at the games that have been played so far in Bolton and MK Dons. It may not prove this way, but that's two games against sides you would expect to be up at the top end of the table. They played a newly promoted side in Forest Green Rovers. They've played one of the league's battlers in Burton, and then a Shrewsbury side with some experienced players in it. And now a relegated side, a team coming down from the Championship. Barnsley, they've come down with maybe a bit of a learning curve to go on, maybe a similar learning curve to the one Ipswich had a few years ago. I think they're sitting 16th in the table heading into this one after a mixed start, but they come with some good football players, but not necessarily the start that they would have hoped for behind them. What are you thinking going into this game?
Yeah, they've been down in League One. It's not like they've been away for decades, is it? They've been down to League One in fairly recent times. I think they bounced back at the first time of asking. I should have probably double checked that before we came on to record this, but I guess that, that doesn't really count for much, because it will be a whole different set of players now that are going through that sort of welcome to League One learning process. Certainly, Ipswich have gone through that. I think a lot of these so-called bigger clubs it hits them in the face at some point that this isn't going to be the League One tour that sometimes is in people's minds when they come down to this division. And it's been a mixed start for them so far. They've lost to Plymouth, they've lost to Derby, they've lost to Wickham, they've beaten Bristol Rovers, they've beaten Cheltenham. And crucially, they played in midweek. They'd got through. They beat Middlesbrough in the first round of the League Cup, and then they went to Leeds on Wednesday night, which gives them one less day to recover for this game, and lost 3-1 there. So maybe Ipswich losing that game to Colchester in the first round has just proved beneficial here in terms of this fixture and having a few extra days rest, just as they did against Shrewsbury recently.
Yep, a nice free week leading up to this game. If you look up and down the Barnsley team sheet, there's one name that jumps out. We'll talk about him now. James Norwood, obviously released by Ipswich at the end of last season after 3 years. He's not been starting every game. I don't think he started either of the last two league games. He did start in that game at Leeds on Wednesday, played the first hour, and I think it was something like he touched the ball 6 times during his time on the pitch in that game, which isn't very many times. But he'll be coming back to Portman Road with a point to prove, won't he? He's not scored for Barnsley yet, and his last competitive goal was at Portman Road in front of the North Stand with almost his final touch as an Ipswich player. So whether he's starting or on the bench, I'm sure he'll make it onto the field. And one thing that James Norwood always did was make himself hard to ignore, whether it was on the pitch or off it. So he's bound to be at least some kind of factor this weekend.
Yeah, I think the fact that he scored on his final game, like you say, with his final touch for the club, and last season ended on a bit of a positive note, I think, and the way he did sort of quite a classy statement as he left, I think means that he'll get I'm not going to go overboard. It's not going to be sort of a hero's return, but I don't think he's going to get the boos either. I think it will just be sort of a middle of the road reception, which is probably the least thing that James Norwood wants. That's anything that's going to push his buttons the least is probably best for Ipswich Town. I think before he got a bee in his bonnet playing against Forest Green, one of his former clubs, and we know that kind of fires James Norwood up. So I would say to the Ipswich fans, don't poke the beast with James Norwood at the weekend. Yeah, whether he starts or comes on, but that's definitely going to be in everyone's back of everyone's minds coming into this game, that there's a potential subplot there for sure.
Yeah, we know what to expect from him, don't we? Plenty of hard work, putting himself about, not always the highest kind of quality, but plenty of endeavour, capable of quality and capable of popping up in really good areas and finishing nicely with whichever part of his body he deems fit. I've just got these images, Stu, of Barnsley scoring a goal at some point in this game and James Norwood taking an age to get back to the halfway line and kick off again before suddenly sprinting off, and that's when the boos will come, or when he's out warming up doing something silly.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I mean, obviously, Barnsley manager now is Michael Duff, who was at Cheltenham last season. And if you remember, Cheltenham came to Portman Road, parked the bus, 0-0, lots of time wasting. Boring Cheltenham was the chant from the Ipswich fans. And then Michael Duff afterwards kind of said their crowd was more interested in us than they were supporting their own team. So throw a bit of proverbial S-housery in from James Norwood, and you wonder whether a similar pattern could unfold. I don't think Barnsley will come to Portman Road and look to be quite as negative as Cheltenham. They're a club that should have higher ambitions this season, you would think. But yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yep, another big crowd in at Portman Road this weekend, 25,000 at least, it sounds like, for this one. We're more interested in Ipswich, though, aren't we? They're the League One pace setters. They're top of the table, and it's about what they do rather than what the opposition does. And for me, there's a couple of interesting talking points in the team lineup this week and what McKenna does. We're recording this before Kieran McKenna's pre-match press conference, so we're not sure if Wes Burns is good to go. But the hope has to be that a full week off, as you previously mentioned, Stu, will be good for him to get back on the pitch. He's straight back in if he's fit, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah, if he's fit, but we're talking about a groin strain here. I always felt in the back of my mind last season that, we'd heard in the early weeks that Wes Burns was managing a nagging Achilles problem. I think he always had a couple of little muscle injuries that he was able to kind of get through. There was always that fear that their sort of talisman, ultimately their top goal scorer, was going to break down at some point. He didn't, but he has gone away with Wales at the back end of last season, and maybe they'll just wrap him up in cotton wool a little bit, especially when there's plenty of options to play on that right hand side. Not necessarily like for like in terms of what Wes Burns can do in the team, but they've coped in the last two games without him. Maybe they'll have to again. As you say, we'll find out a little bit more from Kieran McKenna later on.
If they do have to do without him, I think I'd probably be going back to Caden Jackson in this one, a bit more front foot, a bit more attacking in that role. I'm going to run through an 11, Stu. There's a couple of talking points in there that I think you'll probably pick up on, and then we'll go from there. How do you feel about that?
I feel good. Shoot.
Feel good. That's what we want. Christian Walton in goal. A back three. I'll say back three of Danasi and Wolfenden, and I'm going to put George Edmondson in there. We'll go for Burns, Morsey, Evans, Leif Davis, Chaplin, Harness, and then Freddie Ladapo up front.
I agree with you on Caden Jackson being the man that they will turn to on the right. And Kane Vincent-Young did very well last weekend at Shrewsbury. Should have had that penalty early on. From the highlights I've seen of Barnsley, they look vulnerable to pace. They're two wide centre-backs. They've got some big lads at the back who are going to be a threat from set pieces, and that's something that Ipswich need to be mindful of defensively. But going forwards, I think pace and high intensity is where Ipswich can get at this Barnsley team. And therefore, if you want pace, you look at Caden Jackson on that right-hand side, who I thought made a decent fist of that sort of hybrid right wing-back role in the previous game. I agree, again, for those reasons that I've just mentioned, that Ladapo comes back into this side, someone who runs in behind. Couple of other areas that I would question. Maybe Cameron Burgess remains on the left side of the defence. I can see why people would say Edmondson to come back in. But Barnsley have scored scored off a set piece, certainly in their last league game. They look like they've had some chances from set pieces. Maybe Burgess is the man to deal with those things. And then the other question mark is the two in behind. Again, I can absolutely see why Harness, Chaplin look to be the first two choices there, but Tyrus John Jules is making himself quite difficult to overlook with the way he performed at Shrewsbury last weekend. If you're looking for that pace and directness, do you try and get him in the team? And if you're going with Ladapo, do you get him in as one of the two number 10s? So maybe John Jules to sort of play as that inside left forward and Harness to dip out on this one. But it's starting to have some really big decisions for Kieran McKenna to make now.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing I'd maybe hold back John Jules on is if anticipating that Jackson may need to play wide right, that would have all three of your central strikers on the pitch from the start of the game, and I think it's pretty clear they like to bring one off the bench. So I'm not sure how comfortable I'd be not having a fresh central striker. Good to go for now. I would stick with Harness and Chaplin because I think they're the most likely source of goals from that position. I know John Jules obviously scored at the weekend, but I think he was selected to play that game as a kind of a horse for course. And I think he can have a real impact from the bench still. So I'd go Chaplin and Harness, but these aren't bad conversations to have, are they, Stu? These are all players that we've seen impact games for Ipswich already this season, and we're having to pick three from six.
It's mad that I'm even having a conversation about, maybe you could dip Marcus Harness out, who's already scored 3 goals for Ipswich Town, and we're talking genuinely that there's an argument about playing someone else in his position, and that's just one example, isn't it? So, yeah, it's for all the talk about McKenna adding to his squad, he's already got some pretty serious headaches as it is.
Yeah, we've not even mentioned Richard Keogh so far as being an option to come into this team. He's almost been forgotten already. I've forgotten about him already. That they've got the most experienced Championship defender ever.
Yeah, I would imagine that the Papa John's Trophy game against Northampton next Tuesday is probably the first time that we'll see Richard Keogh, and then he'll be another factor when we have these various boot room chats going into games, because once he's got those first few minutes under his belt, then I think he'll become a serious part of the conversation as well.
For me, just going back to the defence, just for me, I just think that whole defence functions that little bit more readily with Edmondson in it. I clearly not been at his best in certain games. Same with Wolfenden, which seems ridiculous to say as well, because they're obviously on such a good run of keeping clean sheets in games. But I think for all the good that Burgess has done when he comes into the side, I think the defence just functions that bit more smoothly with Edmondson in it at the moment. And for a home game where you're looking to be on the front foot, I think Edmondson does a better job of getting Town going from the back, but far from perfect. But perhaps a better job than Burgess. But again, each of these defenders has kept a clean sheet the last time they were on the pitch for Ipswich. So we're talking about players who are doing okay. They're doing okay. So whichever version of this gets on the pitch is all good. The only 3 players we've not talked about, Stuart, are Walton, Donatian, Wolfenden, and then Morsey, Evans, and Davis. That all feels kind of set in stone for these kind of games.
I think so, yeah. They're starting to become the names that roll off the tongue, aren't they? Wolfenden, we've talked about as maybe being, not having his best start to the season, and this is by Luke Wolfenden's high standards. If we're talking about Luke Wolfenden, someone who has been linked to Premier League clubs before that could have the same sort of pathway in the game as Adam Webster, for example, who we've seen sort of climb through the leagues and now being linked with Chelsea. Those are the standards that we're holding Luke Wolfenden to now. By no means has he had a disastrous start to the season, but there's just a couple of little areas of his game that he might want to just sort of sharpen up. But I think he's quite important to that central part of the back three, the person who can kind of sweep up the danger, and that suits him quite nicely. But that's where the Keogh part of the conversation might come into things, but not for this weekend, I don't think.
No, without going too far into depth on the Ipswich Town defence, speaking to Janoy Donasian last week about how this defence works, it sounds both really quite complex, but also really natural for those players to operate this system at the moment in terms of how they move. They kind of move as one, and it does sound like it's something that you have to really be kind of in tune with to be able to make it work up to its highest kind of level. So it, it's not. I guess in hindsight, it's not really that surprising that we're waiting for Keogh because it it's going to take time. It's going to take time, and you're right that the Papa John's next week will be a chance for him, I am sure. Anything else you want to talk about Barnsley before we get on to the big predictions? We're going to pause in a second just to show some stats, and while we're showing the key stats to the game, Stu, have a think about anything else you want to talk about before we get on to some predictions.
I just think that this might be a decent time to play Barnsley. They've played in midweek. They're still getting their house in order following relegation. They've got some big players missing. I don't know if Nicky Cadden, who they signed from Forest Green on the left-hand side, will be fit again this weekend. He's missed some games. Michael Heelick, central defender. Herbie Kane, central midfielder. Two very key players that are missing. It just feels like these games are kind of falling at the right time for Ipswich at the moment, which kind of adds to this sense of is this hashtag our time, as the club kind of said in the summer. I hope so. If Ipswich can make it 5 straight wins, that will be the first time since, I believe, October 2003, if to cast your minds that far back, for 5 straight league wins. That is, that included a 4-3 win at Crystal Palace. That might jog people's memories of a very late, dramatic Shefki Kuchi goal to seal that one. So that's how rare 5 straight league wins is. Doesn't happen very often, and a big chance, I think, for Ipswich to make that happen this weekend.
Man, that's nearly 20 years ago. I remember that game vividly. They were wearing a special one-off kit for that, which I had, and then I sold it to my A-level geography teacher. Anyway, that's a story for another day. We'll move on to some predictions, Stu, just to finish things off. The way you speak there means I'll be disappointed if either of us are predicting anything other than an Ipswich Town victory. So hit me.
I am predicting a victory, and I'm feeling pretty confident. Famous last words about this one, but I think the way Ipswich are set up, if they can start fast, play with the same intensity that we saw against MK Dons, utilise that pace, exploit some of those chinks in the Barnsley armour, I think they'll win this one another 3-0. I'll put Ipswich down for.
Comfortable. I've got a comfortable 2-0 win written down. Either of those will be fine, and that will mean Town retain their place at the top of League One, heading into September, heading to Accrington, which would bring all kinds of fun. But Barnsley to negotiate first, and hopefully they can come away with 3 more points this weekend.